Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one's about Exodus.
Hey everybody, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and we're going through the whole Bible, one book per day until we're done. So this time around, we got the second book of the Bible, and it's another big one. This is Exodus. It's written by the same guy, Moses. But the difference here is that Moses was relying on a bunch of sources when he wrote what we looked at in Genesis, because that all happened way before he was alive. But this stuff in Exodus, Moses was there for all of that. Well, I should say almost all of that, because the story starts before he's alive with a political crisis. Several hundred years have gone by, roughly 400-ish, since Jacob on his deathbed gave his blessing to Judah to say the snake crusher, the one who's promised to make everything better and defeat the problem of sin, defeat the curse. He's going to come through your line, weird, screwed up son Judah. And then Jacob dies. And then Joseph dies, but Exodus opens saying that a bunch of time has gone by and everybody forgot. The king forgot about Joseph and his contributions in the family there. And now it's almost like the same thing that happens early on in the book of Genesis. There's been a new multiplication. This family has grown, like what was promised to Abram. You're going to be a great nation. There's going to be a lot of you. But the problem is that it's impossible to see how God is going to raise up this deliverer, this one who is going to crush the curse and defeat the serpent, because though this is now a great nation, it's a great nation totally in slavery, and it's oppressive, awful slavery. It's a people who were promised a land, but they don't have one. They don't own anything. In fact, stuff is so bad here early on, and the Pharaoh of the Exodus is so vindictive in Egypt that he's got this quota of mud bricks that he's making the Hebrews hit every day. But when the Hebrews are like, hey, can we go out in the desert for like 3 days and do a festival and worship God like we're supposed to and stuff? The Pharaoh's like, no. And in fact, quit your whining. I'm going to make your life worse. Now you have to go and get all of your own straw to make your mud bricks, but the quota is going to stay the same. So he's cracking down. But we later find out that this Pharaoh is concerned that there's just getting to be too many Hebrews. And so it's kind of like the Thomas Jefferson situation where he famously said slavery is like having a wolf by the ears. It feels like you're in control, but you're not in control because you cannot let go. Pharaoh needs these slaves to accomplish these giant building projects. He has the Hebrews build a couple of grain storage cities. I mean, these are not small contributions, but their numbers are getting to be so huge that if at any point they're like, wait, why do we follow any of these people? We should just take over Egypt and it'll be our thing now. They might be able to pull that off. So Pharaoh's like, I love having slaves, but we just got to thin out this population a little bit to reduce the risk. And so he orders everybody in the kingdom to throw all the male Hebrew babies into the river. And it's out of this pressure that one lady has a kid who turns out to be Moses. And she puts Moses in the river, sure enough, but not like right in the river. She puts him in a basket and sends him downriver. And he gets adopted into Pharaoh's household and gains all of their knowledge and learning and climbs the ranks just like Joseph did. So we're seeing some story rhyming that looks a lot like the stuff that we saw in Genesis here. Well, before we get any further into the story here, let's just step back and talk about how this book is organized, because it's really straightforward, real easy to understand what's going on. The first half of this 40-chapter book, almost precisely, is the story that I'm telling you right now about Pharaoh and the slavery that was going on and Moses being raised up as this great leader and the confrontation he has with Pharaoh and how God delivers his people from the hand of Pharaoh. Then the second half, almost exactly, of Exodus, all takes place out in the desert at Mount Sinai, where God starts to fill in a bunch of the details of what it's actually going to look like for this huge family of Abraham's descendants, now in the millions, to live in communion with God. We're going to get another covenant in a lot of ways, like the covenant, the deal that God made with Abraham back in Genesis. Okay, so those are the two big parts back to what we're talking about in part one. We got a huge problem. Things look horribly dire, not just for the Hebrew people, but for the whole redemptive plan in general. Much like pretty much every one of the patriarchs before, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, they all more or less have this desert experience, and Moses does as well. He figures out who he is. He kills an Egyptian overlord, and he has to flee. He gives up everything. He marries a lady out in the desert, gets more or less adopted into that family. And then God meets Moses and reveals himself in a burning bush. And he tells Moses, hey, you're going to go back and I'm going to use you. You're going to be my instrument to release these people from bondage. And he's like, well, who should I send me? That's kind of a big deal. And God says, I am. He reveals that his name is essence, is being. And that's a huge step forward for us in our whole Bible story, because now we're getting a better sense of who God is. So Moses goes back and he famously has all those confrontations with Pharaoh, and Pharaoh at first chooses to reject what God is saying through Moses, but then later God hardens Pharaoh's heart. He's not going to get it right is the point. And even after all of these miraculous plagues fall upon Egypt, Pharaoh's still not willing to let him go until finally, in an ironic twist, the Egyptian killing of the Hebrew babies boomerangs back on the Egyptians, and God kills the Egyptian firstborns. The only difference is that God provides them with a way out, and some take it. And the provision that God makes is that anybody who wants their house to be passed over when this judgment comes, all they got to do is kill a lamb and put its blood around the doorposts of their house, interestingly, in a shape that resembles a cross. It looks like this whole blood of the lamb idea is foreshadowing a bunch of stuff that's going to happen in the Old Testament, but also it looks like it's pointing right at Jesus of Nazareth and what happens on the cross, 1,200, 1,400 years later. Anyways, Pharaoh's spirits are broken. He's like, fine, go. And so they just grab everything real quick, and all of the Israelites, all of the Hebrews, they just get moving out into the desert. Well, Pharaoh gets to thinking about it, and he's like, that's a lot of slaves. I'd like to have them back, I suppose. And so he goes and chases them down, and they get pinned up against this great big body of water, the Red Sea, or maybe the Reed Sea. And it looks like everybody's doomed. Everybody's complaining at Moses, but then in yet another one of these gigantic water flood style events, the waters part. The Hebrew people are able to pass through the waters on dry ground. They come out the other side. Pharaoh's army follows them in. The waters close in and they all drown. And now the freedom of the Hebrew people is secured. And as the waters close in, everybody's obviously euphoric, and they sing this amazing song celebrating the character of God and how he sees the lowly and delivers the slaves. And then they make their way through the desert to Mount Sinai. This is where, again, we see a parallel with Genesis. We got that big flood event. Things seem good at first, I guess, when they get off the boat, but quickly human nature rears its ugly head, and we realize that while some evil may have been judged and vanquished, the evil that is bound to the human heart, that is sin and evil and wickedness, is not going anywhere. And now that we get into the second half of the book, I'm just going to level with you. The action slows down quite a bit. Big pacing change. At Mount Sinai, the story just has a couple of basic movements. Moses goes up on the mountain and God starts revealing to him what the deal is going to be, what it's going to look like for them to have a relationship with God. And he gives them the basic broad strokes ground rules. These are the 10 commandments. And over the course of what is effectively a few chapters, he spells out to Moses these basic terms. I'm going to be your God. You're going to be my people. The deal I made with Abraham was unconditional. This deal is a bit more conditional. One way or another, all of the nations are going to know that I am the one true God and that I'm your God and you're my people, because if you obey me, I'm going to bless you in ways they won't be able to miss. But if you disobey me, I'm going to punish you and correct you in ways the nations won't be able to miss. Either way, the point's going to be clear, but this dynamic really is going to set up a lot of the narrative tension for the rest of the Old Testament. And indeed, this thing plays out almost immediately. As Moses is up on the mountain getting more of the fleshed out details about what the law is going to look like, with a particular emphasis on civic law and criminal law, like how people are supposed to treat each other. So this indicates that God is effectively holding himself out as king over his people. While that's going on, down below, Moses' right-hand man, Aaron, is hearing a lot of complaints from people who are still mad. And they're like, you know what, like, could we just make like a big gold calf with some of the gold that God gave us as we were leaving Egypt? And Aaron's like, well, you seem like you really want to. Okay. And even though like the mountain is covered in cloud and they've seen undeniable miraculous stuff, they start worshiping this golden calf. And there's your turd in the punch bowl moment, just like we get after the last deluge incident with Noah and his kid and the tent and whatever was going on there. Here, this gross idolatry happens immediately. Man, what's in those first 10 commandments? You're not supposed to have idols or any gods before me. And they just signed off on this deal, and they're immediately getting it wrong. God is not impressed, and Moses almost has to intervene and be like, whoa, okay. But remember, the point is like how this is going to look in front of the nations, and we get a very human-looking negotiation between Moses and God. Well, God continues to lay things out. He's like, all right, here's the deal. I'm going to dwell among you as your God. It's not going to be a perfect union, but we're going to reestablish something that looks like the connection between God and people, a little sliver of it, like what we saw back in Genesis. So you're going to make this portable dwelling place for me, and I'm going to live in this set apart, super sacred, holy part in the middle of this tent temple, which is going to be called a tabernacle. And again, in the midst of all of this, you got the ugliness going on with the idolatry, but ultimately the tabernacle does get built. And this gets crazy. In chapter 40, God shows up. And in a measurable, empirically observable way, his presence fills this artifact called the Ark of the Covenant, which rests in the most sacred part of this tabernacle. So we leave Exodus having learned a bunch of stuff about the character of God. We leave Exodus with a new covenant between God and these people. But we also leave Exodus with a lot of questions about how this relationship between a perfect God and really flawed people is going to work. I mean, we can't even get it right here at Mount Sinai with God's obvious presence there. How's this going to play out over generations? What's going to happen when people didn't see all of these miracles? In Exodus, Moses kind of patched things up with God through a conversation, but what's it going to look like when Moses isn't there and people screw things up and they need to patch things up with God? All of those questions are going to get answered as we move forward into the next three books, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. When you visualize the book of Exodus, picture the Red Sea crossing and the giving of the law in Mount Sinai. When you think about the theme, reflect on God delivering the Hebrews and making them a people unto himself. And if you don't have time to read the whole thing, make sure to check out Exodus 3, that's Moses' call, Exodus 14, that's the Red Sea thing, Exodus 20, that's the law thing, and then Exodus 32, that's the golden calf. It's kind of a lot of reading for the fast version of Exodus, but kind of a lot happens in here. All right, my friends, with that, level up on the book of Exodus for both of us. That is exciting. And we are on to the book of Leviticus mañana. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast is supported by many of you at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. We're grateful because it supports our family.